Each year, yearbooks label students of each graduating class as most likely to succeed, or most likely to become president, or even class Einstein. Of course, these superlatives are not actually guarantees that this person will have success or become president, or even that this is the smartest person in the class. They say that this person is the sort of person we would expect to become president, or the sort of person who seems very smart. These superlatives are perhaps the closest English parallel to the Latin relative clause of characteristic. As its name implies, it is a special kind of relative clause, and it tells us a characteristic of its antecedent, that they seem to be very smart, for example. As you remember, normal relative clauses are introduced by the relative pronoun, qui quae quod, and contain an indicative verb. Relative clauses of characteristic are also introduced by a relative pronoun, qui quae quod, but they contain a subjunctive verb. So what's the significance of the different mood? You probably remember that indicative verbs indicate something factual, and subjunctive verbs indicate potential. Therefore, a normal relative clause indicates something that is true. To continue one of our earlier examples, a student who will, without a doubt, have success. A relative clause of characteristic tells us about the person or thing's character. It suggests something that is possible, a student who is of the sort that will have success. There is another clue that sometimes helps us recognize relative clauses of characteristic. Their antecedents can be general or negative words, such as the interrogative pronoun, quisquid, or the pronoun nemo, no one. For example, Caesar might ask, "Who is the soldier who is of the sort to bravely wage war?" And Caesar's question contains a relative clause of characteristic. So let's practice this construction by putting this example into Latin. Caesar asks becomes Caesar rogat, and let's work in direct speech to make it easier for ourselves. Who is the soldier who is of the sort who is a mouthful, but it is the best way to translate Latin relative clauses of characteristic into English. Who is the soldier requires the interrogative pronoun quisquid, so it's quis est miles, and then our relative pronoun qui. To get the of the sort to, we make our subordinate verb subjunctive, so bellum gerat for wage war, and fortiter for bravely. Caesar rogat, quis est miles qui bellum fortiter gerat. Let's practice translating a relative clause of characteristic into English now. Esne Gaius vir, qui laudem et gloriam domi et militiae obteniat. We recognize it is a relative clause of characteristic because of the relative pronoun and the subjunctive subordinate verb. There's two ways to translate it. First, we can be very literal. Is Gaius a man who would obtain praise and glory at home and abroad? The question wonders if he is the type of person to obtain success as defined by a Roman aristocrat, praise and glory at home and abroad. But this translation does not make it abundantly clear that we recognize this as a relative clause of characteristic. So even though this translation is perfectly clear, depending on our goals, we may want to translate it slightly differently. Our wording would look one way if we are translating a paragraph of Latin to show we understand the passage, and another way if we are translating a sentence on a test to prove we understand all of its grammar. To show that this is a relative clause of characteristic, we can translate it as, is Gaius the sort of person who would obtain praise and glory at home and abroad? Or as, is Gaius of such a sort that would obtain praise and glory at home and abroad? So, your turn. Here's a third example. Qui discipulus est qui consul sit. How do we know this is a relative clause of characteristic? There are two sure signs. the relative pronoun qui, and the subjunctive sit. The generalizing interrogative adjective qui is a nice clue as well, but a relative clause of characteristic does not require the interrogative adjective or another generalizing word to be there. So how do we translate it? As you probably guessed, there are several acceptable ways to translate this sentence. Here are 3 of them. What student is there who might be consul? What student is of the sort who would be consul? Or, what student is the kind of person who would be consul? You may also have guessed that this would be close to the Roman equivalent of student most likely to become president.